Morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Thanks for coming. This is our annual, it's our second annual industry roundtable event. We're pleased to have Steve Fening and Maria Bennett here to help educate us on some of the barriers that we face in trying to translate our technologies and also hopefully identify some solutions, ways to get started. So to start, why don't we just go through some introductions. Steve Fening is the director of the Case-Coulter Translational Research Partnership. So Steve, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, talk about some of the companies you're involved with, and also a little bit about the program and sort of how to get involved with that.
Sure. So I started my career as essentially a faculty member in orthopedic surgery at Cleveland Clinic. I was there for a number of years until kind of accidentally commercialized a technology that I wasn't, actually it was kind of like a side technology. And that was really exciting to me because the reason I got into this field, and I'm sure the reason most of us got into this field, is to try and make an impact on patient care. And I saw how quickly, relatively quickly, that could make an impact on patients. And so I left the clinic about 5 years ago to explore that space a little bit more. I helped form a nonprofit innovation institute, and about the same time launched my own spinal device company. And I've since come to Case. It's been about 3 years now to run the Coulter program. The Coulter program, in very brief, is a program to support biomedical innovation and head research more in a commercially focused direction. We provide both support and funding for that. I think everyone here I've met before at some point around that. But that's my brief bio.
That's good. So Maria Bennett is the CEO. I think, CEO
yes.
of SPR Therapeutics, which licensed technology from the university. How long ago was that initially done?
Well, we spun out of a parent company that had licensed some original technology, and so I graduated here in biomedical engineering from Case with my master's back in 1998. I recognize a lot of familiar faces that I started my career off back at Case. Started working with a small medical device company at that time that was doing neurostimulation for hand restoration and bladder restoration and spinal cord injury. Got some great experience there in both research and development and clinical studies activities. Then had the opportunity to go off and work at Boston Scientific for a few years, leading large clinical trials there, bringing products to market through the regulatory process and so forth. But had the opportunity to come back to Case and work with a former colleague who had founded a company called NDI Medical. NDI developed a neurostimulation technology that was actually licensed out of Duke from Dr. Warren Grill, who a lot of you I know as well. So Warren and Jeff had developed a platform technology to treat urinary incontinence, and Jeff brought me back to be a part of the clinical and regulatory team with that company. And we developed that technology, brought it to a point in which it had clinical data to support its utilization, and we're out doing some fundraising, and Medtronic was at the table, took a look at it and said, I think we want to go ahead and buy this technology. So we sold that company back in 2008. And Jeff came back to me at that time and said, how about getting into pain management? And I had done my graduate research actually here at Case in the field of peripheral nerve stimulation and pain management. So I said, all right, well, let me take a look at the market, let me take a look at the technology and see if there's an opportunity for us to form a company. So we did a little bit of market research for about a year, did some clinical research. We had been working with Dr. John Shea previously, who I know a lot of you know as well. And I went to John, and after kind of being in industry for a while, we had originally developed a technology John and I had back in the day of a sort of 4-lead tunneling system, peripheral nerve stimulation system, and I just didn't feel like that was going to fly commercially. So I went to John and I said, I'm going to give you one lead. Where are you going to put it? Figure that out, and we can possibly have a product here. So we did some clinical validation work of that single lead system. It played out very well in clinical studies, and so I went back to Jeff and said, I'd love to spin this out as a company. He said, all right, I'd love for you to lead the company. I'll give you 48 hours to go home and talk to your husband about it and to, come back to me and let me know if it's going to fly. So I said, yep, let's go for it. So we spun out SPR Therapeutics in January of 2010. And we have been really developing a base of clinical data and research around multiple different pain indications using our peripheral nerve stimulation technology, platform technology to treat that. So fast forward to July of last summer, we received our FDA clearance for commercialization of our device to treat both chronic and acute pain of the back and/or extremities. So July 23rd at noon, this is now almost 20 years since I started this research back in my graduate studies here. Made a call to Hunter, made a call to a few others, and said, we got it. And so we now are translating our organization from an R&D stage company into a commercialization company. We've hired a VP of sales, we're hiring a sales team. We're going out and we're going to market, and as well as continuing to collect solid clinical data to really support our product commercially and support that adoption and reimbursement and just the overall commercial success.
So there we go. So Erica's over here on the side. She's got a microphone. If anybody has questions or comments, get Erica's attention and participate in the conversation. We're not going to wait till the end. We'll just take questions throughout. So as they come up, just go ahead and ask. So the first thing I wanted to talk about sort of is obviously this technology, Maria, that's not a terribly atypical story, both the time frame and sort of the concept of, well, this was a graduate program and then it bounced around in different things, it changed, it iterated, and then now 20 years later, it's a product. 20 years ago, that idea, if you had shopped it to Medtronic, wouldn't have gotten any traction, and now it might. So it's obviously gained a lot of value over that time. What are the crucial steps to adding value as you go from an idea that you have as a graduate student and that kind of first paper to something that's commercializable, either as an idea or a company that's for sale, or something that physicians would want to buy and prescribe?
That's a great question. So this is going to sound very cliche, and you've probably heard this before, but good products, good companies are bought, not sold. And what I mean by that is that you really need to kind of look at building the value around a product, not necessarily to appease a certain sort of exit strategy, but really building or designing that concept to build that up to compete. So we like to think of our organization as building to compete, not building to exit, because if we build to compete, we're going to hit those critical value inflection or value milestones along the way. So as a concept, as far as a design concept or a technology concept, the most critical things in those early stages are, probably many things that you are aware of, but, does it have, viability in the marketplace? Is it something that's going to be, easily adopted by clinicians? So, we found it very important to get our key opinion leaders, our KOLs, our clinicians involved very early in not only the design of the technology, but also just what clinical outcomes did they need to see in order to accept that or adopt that into their practice. So really focusing on those key clinical outcomes with those KOLs. And then it used to be, such a significant barrier to get FDA clearance, which it still dramatically is. But with the changing healthcare system today, the more significant barrier today is really getting insurance or payer coverage as a reimbursement for the device. So it's kind of, I know it may seem early to even be thinking about some of those things, but when you have a technology or you have a concept in which you think that it can really make a significant clinical outcome or difference in a patient's life and really in clinical practice, it's not too early to start thinking about those different parameters of what it's going to mean to the clinical practice. Does it save cost? Does it get a patient, out of rehab, faster? Do they get discharged to home instead of getting, discharged to a skilled nursing facility? Are there things or costs that you're taking out of the system because it replaces a competitive technology? Those are the types of things that I think an acquirer, a partner, a commercial partner will be looking for, because they need to be able to plug that technology into their bottom line and say, okay, how is this going to be ultimately commercially successful? Obviously, all the details around the technology, is it easy to use? Is it user-friendly? Again, does it have, and generate safe and efficacious clinical outcomes? Those are critical to getting to that point of regulatory clearance and commercial viability. But it's not too early to start thinking about the whole picture of kind of what it's going to mean to clinical practice and working with those key opinion leaders to kind of get some of that input early on.
Steve, my impression of the Coulter program is that it's designed as a bolus of money to add a lot of value in one particular step. Can you talk about where that falls and where you think that value?
Sure. I agree with everything Maria said. I think that there's also another way to look at it is the value of your company is kind of like a step function. So you get to these certain milestone events, and the company doesn't just gradually increase in value, it jumps significantly. And some of those, many of us are aware of, like regulatory clearance, or the first clinical use in patients, or the first sales, or when the company's finally making revenue, or when it's actually profitable. Those are all significant milestones. But one of the other complicated things, particularly in our environment right now, is that your timing is really important too. It's not just when you were talking about Medtronic being interested in this technology 20 years ago versus now, it's not just that the technology is advanced, it's that the market is now accepting of something that maybe it wasn't accepting of 20 years ago. And today, or vice versa. And today our healthcare environment is changing at a really rapid pace, and most people expect that to continue. So it is hard knowing that you're going to take 10 plus years to develop a technology, and you're not really sure what the market's going to be like in 10 years.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. Is it true that the value of the company is sort of inversely proportional to the risk that's involved? Is that a key driver there, or how much role does the forward risk play in the current value of the company?
Yeah, it definitely plays a part in when you're out raising money. So, I mean, if you're depending upon which stage of the company that you're out at and what type of funding you're trying to attract, then it definitely play a part in that role. So if you're trying to, attract institutional dollars from strategics, large companies, or from venture capitalists, they're definitely more risk adverse, definitely on the venture capital side. And so they're looking for you to knock down as many of those risks as possible before investing. And they really just want to put in money to kind of most of the folks that we see, especially in med tech, one is put in the money to grow the organization once it's kind of at that point where many of the risks have been reduced and it's ready now to commercialize and grow. So it just depends, I think, but Steve is exactly correct that, when there's these value markers along the way, and that's what, the valuation of the company or the valuation of the product or the opportunity for it is, how you're reducing those risks and basically knocking down those barriers to create that value along the way.
Yeah, I think you're right. Risk is inversely proportional to, the value of the company. Yeah. I think our Coulter program, what we focus on is reducing risk to make it more commercially attractive. But there's a lot of risk in these projects. I mean, especially at our stage when they're pre-company, a lot of them haven't been tried out in a person. And at the same time, companies and VCs, everyone is wanting something that's less and less risky, which means typically that it's a lot more money has been invested in it. It's taken a little bit further down the stream than they have maybe 5 to 10 years ago. So that kind of the gap in getting to something that is at a acceptable risk threshold is becoming larger.
Is that a function of how healthcare economics is changing, or is that a function of sort of the availability of venture capital dollars? Where does that risk appetite, it is hard to get, especially early stage money.
Right. So what we've heard from kind of the later stage venture capitalists is that they are more risk adverse just because of the exits that they're seeing, the comparable transactions that they're seeing in the marketplace are not as great potentially in med tech as they will be in other industries. So they're wanting not to bake out as many risks as possible before they put their dollars in to say then, okay, this company is really viable at this stage to realize an exit opportunity. So that's the more traditional in med tech VCs. There are many earlier stage investors, institutional investors that are willing to take more risk. We've taken an approach where we've actually just focused on non-dilutive dollars that have come in through grants and contracts. So we have a very talented grant writing team. Dr. Josh Boggs, who many of you may know as well, is our VP of R&D and has led that effort and to secure over $23 million in grants and contracts. So we just executed a $6 million contract with the Department of Defense this week, and they, especially the Department of Defense, I think, is really resonating towards opportunities to really seed new technologies, advance new technologies through both grants and contracts. So a lot of great opportunities there, as well as NIH, as I think many of you know as well.
But I do think some of the transition for more later stage is driven by the overall fact that there's not enough venture capital being invested in technologies. I mean, if you take a step back and think about it from a VC perspective, they're there just to make money, right? To try and make a 10% return on investment. And if they can pick things that are less risky, I mean, why wouldn't you do that? So if they were forced, if there weren't as many investment opportunities because there was more investors investing in the same opportunities, then I think that they'd be forced to invest in a little earlier stage. But they're able to sit back and kind of cherry pick.
Do you feel, Maria especially, do you feel like competing for venture funding, diluted funding, do you feel like you were competing against like Silicon Valley app companies and sort of healthcare IT? Is that where the money's going and you're trying
Absolutely.
to get some attention? Is that how that works?
Very much so, yeah. So I mean, it's very, it's funny too. I mean, it's very coastal. So, the VCs that are, seated mostly on the West Coast or the East Coast, believe it or not, they like to invest in companies that are in those areas because they got to travel to board meetings and they don't want to travel all over the country. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. And they'll say, okay, we just need companies that we can fit into basically our, kind of logistics and our schedules and see reasonable returns on our investment in a short time period. And so it's tough being in the Midwest. I mean, having a company that is attracting venture dollars in the Midwest, it's not easy. There are more firms that are emerging in the Midwest to kind of, again, be at an earlier stage, I think, with some of those companies because there's so much great research and technology coming out of the universities around here, but it's tricky, it's difficult. So again, we've been kind of just creative with our funding, and I think a lot of other organizations similar to us have done the same. Otherwise, if you go to venture dollars too soon, you are going to be squeezed down and taken down on valuation significantly because they're going to want to own and control as much as they can in that early going so that they can, kind of have that return on their timeline, not necessarily maybe the timeline that is best suited for the, most valuable opportunity or exit opportunity for the company.
But I think there also has been some recent movement where there's getting more interest in investing in Midwest type companies. This is as VCs are kind of being squeezed to get their returns, and the costs that it takes to run a company out on the coast is very high, and those companies are really good at spending money fast. Midwest companies just generally are more thrifty, I would say, and so there's more investigation. I don't know if it's actually happening yet, but they're more around.
Yeah, they're definitely more attractive and see the sort of conservativeness or efficiency that the Midwest companies have.
Those are definitely the talking points, right? You can hire an engineer here for a lot less than you can hire one in Silicon Valley.
Right.
Where do you see, so in talking about risk, one last question on this is that where do you see sort of academic investigators that are interested in heading to market? Where do you see the biggest disconnect in that? The step valuation of risk. Where's the biggest thing that people aren't thinking about that could add the most value? Is there one thing, Steve? Especially, I think you probably see a lot of these. At immature technologies.
Yeah, at a very early stage, the biggest disconnect is solving a real clinical need. So, I think with the FES Center, that might not be as much of an issue. But in general, a lot of technologies that come out of universities are what's referred to as technology push, which is you come up with a technology that is cool and is novel, and then after that, you try and find out what application you can solve using that technology. And that's kind of sometimes a challenging approach to doing that. And so that disconnect is a huge one.
You agree with that, Maria?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the unique aspect of the FES Center is just the collaboration that you all have with, and the access that you have to clinicians and to key opinion leaders that can really provide, that input to you as far as what the clinical needs are, so that you're not pushing a technology on them, but they're really having that input and that buy-in to the development of the technology.
And I think it's getting more complicated than it used to be. I think if you partnered with a clinician, you understood the clinical need, that was enough. But now the hospital environments and the way things are purchased, and it needs more than that. So it's not just having a clinical colleague, it's understanding the way that the healthcare flows and how things are purchased and all these things. I think it's more complex than it was before.
Yeah. I think it's, so the process now too, they have these many facilities, value analysis committees that are looking at the risk benefit of a product or a therapy before they approve that purchase into the hospital. It used to be that, the doctor said, oh, I love this, I want to use this, go get it for me. And it's not that way anymore. So I think that value analysis approach, though, it's just the traditional things that you all are learning about, risk benefit. So, can we justify the benefit of our device, given the risk and so forth, and how is that explained to, a facility, a hospital, and purchasing sort of mindset as far as cost and the clinical benefit.
Yeah. Physicians definitely see the clinical need, but I think historically they don't understand the economics of that need. They see that they see a lot of patients, but they don't understand how that correlates to the rest of the country, and they don't understand the costs associated with that too. I know when I was at the clinic, we were looking to try and reduce price of total knee replacements, and we did a survey asking the physicians, how much do you think a total knee replacement costs, and no one had a clue. They weren't even close. So they don't have that same type of information that you need to make the complete decision.
Come on, a question?
So, on this theme of risk, I don't think this is working. So.
Yeah, it is.
Oh,
It is.
all right. So now it's working too well. I'm thinking about a company like SPR and, sort of where is your biggest risk hurdle right now? And in my mind, that is whether or not you can get adoption of the technology. And so, maybe can you talk to us a little bit about the various strategies? It seems like there are kind of two obvious ones to me. One is, getting the cool kids to use it, i.e. the key opinion leaders. The other is some kind of alternative marketing strategy where you're sort of, using evidence-based, sort of results and pushing that out. And so, but you only have finite resources, and so how do you balance between those two, and what is sort of the most effective strategy?
Yeah, it's a combination of the two, so you're kind of hit both. But so having a platform technology and having the opportunity to target multiple different pain indications gives us that opportunity to kind of say, all right, where can we get the greatest experience early on while building up maybe some other greater evidence to support some larger indications. So our greatest amount of evidence right now is in shoulder pain following stroke. And so that was my graduate work way back when. And so we're starting in that pipeline of indication because we have the clinical evidence to support the adoption and the reimbursement coverage, for that indication. So we're starting with an indication that's known, and what that will allow us to do is to gain reimbursement traction, albeit it's a smaller market than maybe some of the other, larger pain indications. But again, it'll give us, knock down some of those commercialization risk and saying, do we get reimbursement coverage? Do we get at least some adoption? What kind of, tricks and training and so forth are we going to learn as we roll this out to our key opinion leaders, our clinical champions that have really, it's been born out of their, practice and so forth. And so they're behind this. They want to, support this. Now, as we're thinking about that, we're thinking about then the larger indications that we're also investigating right now. Things such as low back pain and post-surgical pain following knee replacement are two of our larger indications. We have clinical evidence in each of those, but to support true adoption, we're going to need more clinical evidence, and just even though we've got the regulatory clearance to support the coverage and the reimbursement, just because they're larger indications, and it's going to be on payers' radar that, hey, if this starts coming across my desk, you better have the clinical evidence, to support it. So we're doing that in parallel with the rollout of the shoulder pain device, but as well talking to those KOLs, those interventional pain specialists that are, the cool kids that are using the devices today to treat low back pain and other things, using the spinal cord stimulation devices to treat those things. So they're already part of our network. They're part of our studies. They're in these facilities that we are targeting for our early rollout. And commercially, I think that many companies may think as though they try to put multiple dots across the map and say, oh, look at all these places that we are. Our strategy is that we're going to show deep penetration in 3 to 5 key geographies. And so we will, get these facilities up and going with a, first indication, follow on with our next indications. That not only shows adoption for those early indications, but it shows repeat buying and so forth, which are what, the strategics then can say, hey, if we can plug and play Northeast Ohio or DC Philly or North Carolina into our model, we can now see where the trajectory is for this. But again, we're building to compete, and but we think that that would be attractive as well to the strategics.
I'll make one comment on the key opinion leaders. They're really important for the marketing of the technology when you're trying to sell it. But most medicine is practiced outside of academic medical centers, right? 80-some% of the market is not going to be, way more than that, is not going to be key opinion leaders. So I think you need to obviously get their feedback, and they can help with the design and the marketing, and they're going to be in many ways the face of the product. But you also need to make sure that your product fulfills the needs of the vast majority of users as well. I think a lot of times in academia, we get stuck on talking with the thought leaders and thinking that's the market. And lots of products get stuck there because they're focused on academic medical centers, and they can't get past that.
Right. A lot of them are crossing over between academic medical centers and then ambulatory surgery centers now too, especially in the pain space. They have shared sort of appointments at both. And so those are the ones that I agree with Steve, that have kind of different perspectives, because they may be running their own practice. And so they understand the economics. They're going to come out and say, well, this looks really cool and this could treat a lot of patients, but if it's, if it costs this, or I can't get reimbursed for this, it's not going to work here. Or if it, requires 5 extra people to, assist me in this procedure, and I've got to pay for 5 other people to, do this, that's not going to work either.
I think in DBS, that's probably one of the big holdups to market expansion, is that it's pretty well stuck in an academic medical center environment right now.
You want it back now?
Gift.
Ms. Bennett, I'd like to ask about the device that you're using. I heard single lead somewhere along there. Is this a totally implanted system?
No,
This uses a wire through the skin? And it has then some other return electrode somewhere else, and the stimulator itself is outside. So when you take a device like this out to the community, what kind of speed bumps do you run into when they see this device and how it's going to be used, and how do you overcome those?
Yeah, great question. So yes, this is a percutaneous peripheral nerve stimulation device. So it is a wire through the skin, connected to an external stimulator and return electrode. It is designed to be used and approved to be used for up to 30 days, and then completely removed at the end of that therapy. So in the traditional chronic pain world, where everybody's used to spinal cord stimulation systems that treat pain, the biggest hurdle that we had to overcome was showing our KOLs and clinicians that we had data that supported not only significant pain relief while the device is being used, but after the device has been removed, we see a sustained effect. So there is some aspect of our mechanism of action that we have intellectual property protecting that is actually resulting in a sustained effect. So it was a huge barrier at first to convince, first of all, that you could leave a percutaneous lead in for 30 days without a risk of infection. These docs are used to leaving catheters, blocks in for no more than a couple days to a week. So how in the world could we leave a percutaneous lead in and that be safe? So we had to collect the safety data, and obviously there's a whole host of data that could support that. And so we were able to kind of get past that barrier. And then the clinical data showing that we had this sustained effect as well has gotten past the barrier of, okay, well, we can see that if for a less costly system that can be used earlier in the treatment continuum, that doesn't require surgery, and that is drug-free, then this is something that we're at least willing to try, because if it does have an effect not only during those 30 days but afterwards, then this is something that I would, the doctor, would want to try earlier than obviously going down a path towards surgery. So the patients that we're treating, many of them are prior to surgery. We've done market research amongst clinicians, and we asked them, well, what would be the primary thing that this would replace? And they said opioids, of course. So it's an unfortunate opportunity in our country right now with the opioid crisis that we have an alternative, potentially to that. So it's critical now in our clinical studies that we continue to collect that data as well to show that we can not only be an alternative to opioids, but potentially, reduce opioid use for those patients that are on it. So those are some of the barriers that we faced early on. As folks looked at this technology early on, though, they said, well, this is a no-brainer for an acute pain indication, or a post-surgical type pain indication. So we've also are in that market as well, and are collecting data and supporting that indication that following surgery, that this could be something that could again be an alternative to opioids and be treating pain following surgery.
Ask her to expand on.
Would you expand on
The,
the,
how do you convince the physicians that running the wire through the skin would be okay? This is my
got it. How did you convince clinicians that running a wire through the skin would be okay?
It took a long time, Dr. Mortimer. So this is something that, so we, in the early going of our company, we would do scientific, clinical, and advisory board meetings. So if you think of the acronym there, Warren fondly called this the SCAB. And so we had the SCAB meetings, and so we would have, periodic meetings amongst scientists and clinicians talking about the technology, talking about, the data that we had collected, talking about the data that they would need to see in order to, accept a percutaneous lead through the skin for 30 days. So we then, just worked to collect that data. We published papers to support that data. We presented at conferences, on that data. And as they use it themselves then, and we, branched this out across multiple different users, they saw how easy, how simple it was. Again, the benefit was so great, and the most significant, adverse event that we had was skin irritation from the bandages. So we've had no incidents of infection now in over 1,300 leads that have been used, and so we've got very solid data, and that supported, of course, our FDA clearance as well.
You were worried that I planted questions. That was a...
Hey.
So this is another question for Maria, because I see Steve all the time. Yeah. So Maria, can you talk about your approach to CMS and how you did that? How early you got in there? What parts of CMS were you talking with? How did those discussions go? How did you finally get, I assume, adequate, coding and reimbursement from the coding once you got the whole thing even started? Can you discuss that process?
Can you explain that jargon term?
No, she will.
So CMS is Center for Medical Area Service. So they are the FDA of the reimbursement world. So they basically determine coverage and coding policies for getting a device or a therapy paid for. So we actually, we're fortunate that there are existing codes already for this technology. So there's an existing code that says percutaneous, placement of a peripheral, lead. So we did not have to do any work to create a new code. And then we worked with reimbursement experts in the field. So I know Andy wanted to talk a little bit about just the team and how you kind of build a team around you. We have always been, making sure that we're not only internally focused, but externally focused and working with as many experts in the field that we can. And so we brought together, a reimbursement team that were specialists in coding and coverage in health economics, because it all ties together. It's not just the code, it's not just the payment, it's, how does it all work with the economics of the pricing of the device and so forth. So their counsel to us was actually not to talk to CMS. So we have not had a conversation with CMS, and the counsel was, you have codes, you have data that supports the codes, you have, clinicians and so forth that are supporting that. And so what the tactic that we have taken is there's something called prior authorization, in which if a patient's identified for this therapy, a clinician prescribes it to them, you can go and seek prior authorization from the payer, Blue Cross Blue Shield, whoever it is, and then get that prior authorization before the device is actually used. So we're using a service to help us get that prior authorization, so then physicians don't have to manage the appeal and denial process if that would occur after they seek reimbursement.
So who is the population? Is it an over 65 population? What about the private payers? You were just saying Blue Cross Blue Shield. What, you're addressing that differently or the same, using the codes of CMS codes? And
yeah, it's the gamut. So it's, we found in our studies, even in the stroke studies, that the average age was early to mid 50s. So it's not just the over 65 population. Medicare is its own animal, and so if there are patients on Medicare, you can't get prior authorization, but there is opportunity for coverage there. There are coverage policies that support these codes as well. But on the private payer side, it's kind of be one-offs, and that's why there's a service that that we found, and they're going to help us to seek that prior authorization, and so that we can navigate that. That's why it's so important to get this reimbursement traction and these early indications, and with the solid clinical data that we have to support it.
And just before I hand this to Cameron, who's very anxious to ask a question, why did they tell you not to talk to CMS?
Well, because if you go down that path, it's similar with FDA too. So, and I'm in my years of experience with FDA and your years of experience with FDA, I mean, once you ask a question, they can say something in a meeting. They can take you down a path. Nothing's gospel until they put it into writing, and then what they put in writing may be very different than what they say to you in the meeting. So it's very difficult to navigate sometimes that communication, and if you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. And so
I've heard that from many companies, okay? And I can't figure out whether it's hearsay, heresy, or fact, right? So do you know whether that's, if you talk to them, it will all go sour?
not that it will go sour, it's just that it's how much value do you get out of that meeting? Because again, they could say anything that they want in that meeting, and it may be something that will take you down a path that will be very helpful. It may not, and so it's like, it's just, what are you trying to get out of the meeting? So it's very important to say, okay, here's our objective for the meeting. If it's a very clear objective, it's maybe just negotiating 1 point of a clearance or an IDE or whatever it may be with FDA, then that's fine. But if you're just going in there with an open sort of, hey, we're going to market, and this is what we're going to do, they're going to tell you what they think you should do, and that may not be necessarily aligned with the strategy at that time.
You want to go in there with a strategy, right? I mean, particularly with FDA, the worst thing is to go in there and say, what do you think we should do? Because FDA is more risk averse than anybody else. They're going to make the testing they have to do worse than anything that you would dream up. So. With the same thing with CMS, you have to understand what you're hoping to get out of that engagement if you need to, and if there's something you want to get out, how you're going to actually get to that point.
Exactly. Yep.
I mean, I guess I would also think about it from maybe more of an exit perspective, though. It's really mitigating your risk, or you're limiting the risk that you're imposing upon a potential acquirer, right? Mm-hmm. Let them make the decision. Let them take. Or make the strategic decision of exactly how they would want it to be reimbursed. You don't want to get in the middle of that. That's not your business. Right. But I think that's in conflict then with this. Are you, can't remember the words that you're saying, but, building versus competing or whatever. Are you trying to build something that's a standalone that you're going to go head to head with the big boys, for multiple years? Or do you want to just get to a point where you say, okay, I've proven it. I'm now on the market, and I'm not making bones about trying to be a competitor. I want to be an exit, right? And so, I mean, to me, that's a disconnect between what I see in the Midwest med tech versus what I see in the coastal med tech. Yeah. And I think that the Midwest is, kind of doing it incorrectly because it's too conservative in that regard. But.
Well, I think to just to your point, to kind of close that gap of conflict, I mean, if you build to compete, then that exit will occur. It sounds very cliche, but if you think about it, it's like, okay, I'm building to that next value point. So if that value point is reimbursement traction, or like that's where we're at right now, and getting that additional clinical data in the large markets, we're going to get to that point. I think that we would be ripe for opportunity, a partner, and exit. But if that's doesn't occur, we can't predict what the strategics are doing. They're turning upside down, turning over people every other day. So we can't build to what we think they're going to want to see. We just know what a good, successful company would look like. And so if we build to that, then it should be a plug and play opportunity with the right organization.
But so I mean I understand the philosophy. I agree. But back to this question about the coding.
Yeah. Do
you agree that it's sort of a risk mitigation so that you're pushing that bigger decision off to a future partner or whatever?
As far as the coverage decisions and that sort of thing, absolutely, yeah, because that's a much bigger play. I mean, that could come out later down the road, but yeah, they want to navigate that language and all of that. Agreed. Yep.
Dennis had a question.
I'll ask mine in the break here. Maria, I have two questions, actually. The first is, what happens after 30 days if the patient still feels they need the device? Do you have to explant and reimplant? Or, how do you plan to handle that? And the second question is, as far as CMS and reimbursement, can you tell us what is your price, what's the price of your device, how much are they reimbursed,
Mm-hmm.
and what's the out-of-pocket expense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the 30-day use, again, so about 80% of our patients right now are getting a sustained effect. So for those 20% that have, not a sustained effect or a return of pain earlier than what would be sort of manageable as far as a repeat dosing, because this system could be used, and clinicians have said, oh, we'd love to use this maybe, once a year or once every 6 months even, they think would be tolerable. But if it does happen to, return earlier than that, we do have an implantable platform technology that we actually just got a $3 million CRP commercialization readiness program, pilot program grant from NIH to support the advancement of that technology so that we can have a full suite of platform to say, okay, for that 20% of patients, or more, depending on the indication, we can treat them as well with an implantable device if that's what would be required. So we have that option available to us. As far as the pricing, I think I can share with you at least the pricing. For the device itself, a single procedure kit is $4,900, and then there's a multi-procedure kit, which there's 4 systems in kind of a 4-pack of single kits that's priced a little bit less, so at a discount. For the hospitals and for the ambulatory surgery centers, the reimbursement to a hospital right now for both placement and removal is about $8,000. To an ambulatory surgery center, it's about $6,000. So there's, overhead to work with on, from the hospital and the ambulatory surgery center perspective as far as any overhead that they would incur from using the device.
And so do they get prior authorization for $15,000 worth of stuff?
No, they would do it on, the prior authorization would be on a single patient thing. So there's 2 different issues. So on the hospital purchasing, so that goes through the value analysis committees, and the hospital purchasing could get authorization for that. But then for the actual utilization, there's prior authorization on per patient, and it would just be for them, the single system for the patient.
Okay, and then related to the 30 days, so is Neuros a competitor now with your implanted system?
I do not see Neuros as a direct competitor, no. So.
Dennis, do you have a question?
So a lot of the questions that we've had so far have been really insightful because they've been coming from folks that have gone through this process at least to some degree. And then there are those of us that are completely naive. So a lot of us have things that we've been testing preclinically, maybe even have done some translational steps testing approaches in human study participants, but then are very naive to what's on the other side of this figurative curtain. So what should someone be thinking about to take that next step to get, because we want is to see this thing making a difference for people with that indication. There's a great big ocean in between doing something in human study participants and having this thing clinically available. So how do you start? What are the things that an investigator should be considering? What are the actionable items? What are pitfalls? Can you tell us about how we're supposed to be engaging in this process?
Maybe I'll start on
Yeah,
that
why don't you
one.
start?
I think that one of the easiest things to start with is to try and get feedback from people on the other side of the curtain. So if you talk to, if you think your technology is going to be acquired by a big company, or if it's going to be acquired or started up by a startup CEO and invested, getting some feedback from them on where the technology would need to be for them to take a risk on the technology. That can help kind of line up the research that you're able to do inside the university to get it attractive for that. If that makes sense. And most companies are willing to talk to you. If you go talk to them about your technology and say, this is it, and they say, look, we're interested in it. It's a market that we're interested in, but you have to put the device in 20 patients and have outcomes for 6 months. And if you do that, come back to us and we'll talk. And then you have kind of a pipeline of what you need to do.
Yeah, I think that's the best approach is just, if you've got an idea, you think it's a fit commercially with that, whatever that company or, potential users, would want to use it for, then kind of talk to them and see, okay, what are they going to be looking for? What's the next step that they would want to see from you to demonstrate the value of that opportunity? And they'll give you that insight. And again, take it always with a little grain of salt, maybe get a couple different opinions if you can, because, that person that you talk to may not be, around, or, I mean, again, there's a lot of just turnover with, different organizations and such, but they'll, in those early stages, it's pretty standard, well, they'll say, okay, we want at least, we need to see at least this feasibility or this pilot stage of this study done so that it's ripe for, going and talking to FDA and seeing if we're on a track for regulatory clearance, something like that.
Kind of along those lines, if Dennis has this technology, he has some IP behind it, and he has a little bit of clinical data, who's, besides getting opinions from people behind the curtain, who's the first person, you mentioned this, Maria, that it's about a team, you got to build a successful team. And Steve, you and I talked earlier in the week, and you said, like, the technology is only, at this point, a small piece of the puzzle. The sort of commercialization team is tends to be a bigger concern, especially as you start looking for dilutive funding. So who's the first person that Dennis needs to get on his team? Is it a CEO? Is it a regulatory consultant? What's the crucial piece of the team at that point?
I mean, it really depends what stage the technology's at. I mean, if you've just applied for a patent, you probably haven't heard back from the patent office for quite a while. There's people within the university that can help to try and get you head in the right direction. Our program definitely does that. There's other assets as well. And I think you can drive the value of the technology a long way before you have to really think about hiring a CEO.
I would agree. Yeah, I think that working either with resources at the university, or there's contract research organizations that have experts in regulatory and in clinical fields that could support efforts there, or at least give guidance as far as their experience with it. But building a team to advance a clinical idea or a technology is one thing, and then kind of depending upon where that is as far as building out a company, just again, it just depends on what stage you're at. So we started in R&D, and so we my first resources were hiring clinical research associates and clinical project managers and PhD research engineers and biomedical engineers. Now we've built out manufacturing team and engineering teams, and then commercialization teams. So, but I think with any of it, I take hiring very seriously, and we've always made sure that it's the right fit at the right time. And if it's okay to work with the consultant and for a period of time, then that's fine. We've also interned a number of individuals that then may play out to be hired, and it's an opportunity for that individual to kind of get experience with the organization, but also for us to get experience with them as well.
So Steve, go ahead.
Going back to the team thing, you can still build a team around you within the university, right? You can find people, especially being from the Cleveland area, people are pretty generous with their time. So you can find people from the business community, you can find people that have the experience in translating the technology, and Cameron's shaking his head a little bit. Maybe he'll be happy to help you. But people are willing to, people are generally willing to give you a little bit of advice and help you. It doesn't always need to be in a formal structure of a company.
Right.
And does Dennis just have a flag that he puts up on his desk, and all these people come flocking to him? Or is there a point of contact?
So, I saw Griffin come in the door. He's starting the I-Corp program. So one of the things that you can do is when you talk to people and you find one person that you're sure is going to be good and helpful, ask them who else should be on the team. So you use your contacts to find more contacts. You don't need to find everyone yourself.
Don't forget about docs.
Yeah.
Maria, there's a question from Rockville, Maryland here.
Some random person in Rockville.
Somebody out there in that. So Megan asked, and you alluded to this with your pricing and all, about value assessment by hospitals and what the process and challenges are. The docs are all associated with a hospital, and a hospital buys your product.
Right.
Okay, so you have to go through a value assessment at that hospital to buy your product. Can you talk a little bit about that for this, and how you navigated that space?
Yeah, sure. So we We actually worked with some consultants that had some experience in that space. There's a company called Plant Moran, who is, you may just recognize the name, they're traditionally more accounting and services and such, but they actually have a strong life science arm to them. They're up in Michigan. And so they assisted us in that process in which they did interviews of blinded interviews. They didn't name the product or name the company necessarily, but just described it, generically, and talked about just the different benefits and risk and kind of what the, value analysis committee members would want to see as far as a dossier of information to make that decision around purchasing. And so they did some interviews for us. We as well did, just some interactions with medical directors and such that sit on those committees. And then ultimately the work product, the deliverable that came out of that is a value analysis dossier. And so that dossier is a package of information that, cites clinical studies, the, risk and benefits of the product, the pricing, why that pricing is justified given other, options and technologies available to these patients, what the need is. Especially with our first indication in shoulder pain following stroke, it's a very significant unmet need. It's, patients suffering in silence that have really no other alternatives, to treat their pain. So, just kind of putting all of that messaging, together in a package of information. And then the presentation to the value analysis committee starts with just, okay, here's a simple description of the product and here's the pricing, and then we have this value analysis dossier available to them as they ask questions. Some have asked, for presentations, and then many times the clinical champions or the KOLs at those facilities will get involved in giving those presentations. Some are like, okay, this sounds good, we're good to go, and approve it. So it's a full gamut of level of scrutiny that each of those facilities take. But it can take anywhere from a few days to several months to get those approvals at those hospitals.
And do you have to go hospital by hospital?
Yes.
You go. It's not. Is it by system or is it by?
So there are some systems that are service like ambulatory surgery centers or freestanding clinics, and so then you can just kind of once you're approved by the system, then you are able to sell to each of those clinics. But freestanding academic hospitals, they all have their individual committees.
So when you got this dossier and this information back from Plant Moran, were you able to design gaps into clinical trials to address those things?
Yeah. So I think our focus again was on this first indication, which we don't have many gaps, but then we were able to see, okay, these are the things that we need to make sure that we have for the future indications, our pipeline, and be able to capture that information in our studies going forward. Yep.
Danny?
So everything we've talked about so far today has been about the devices industry, and I was wondering if you guys have any knowledge or could just kind of expand our viewpoint about how this would be different for other areas, maybe like surgical tools or software with it seems like imaging is kind of an exploding area.
Sure. I can speak.
I'll start there. I mean, so our program mostly deals with devices and diagnostics, but we'll support pharmaceuticals or really anything. Surgical tools are usually a little different. I mean, they can be devices, but a lot of the same concepts that we're talking about are applied to all of those. It's about risk reduction and trying to understand the market and get the right feedback. The levels of cost associated with them can be dramatically different from software to device to pharmaceutical. But the same concepts are the same, and there are programs within the university to help you for each of those.
The surgical tools arena is a little different in the sense that, if you're designing a surgical tool or you've got something, the economics of that is so critical because the reimbursement or payment around a surgery is usually what, they get one lump sum for that surgery. So if you're going to be adding cost to that surgery with a new tool, it's tricky. But if you're saving costs because it's a tool that saves time, or it's a tool that maybe replaces something more costly. So we have a sister company that has a interoperative nerve stimulator that's used to identify nerves during orthopedic and ENT surgeries. So it is not reimbursed directly, but it's just paid, as part of that package by the hospitals as part of the reimbursement they get for the surgery. But it replaces a more complex system that was previously used that was more costly. So that's probably I don't know as much about the surgical tools and so forth, but that's my familiarity with, kind of being sensitive to those costs, perhaps, of any sort of surgical tool and making sure that it's, economically and makes sense to that surgery. And always for a surgeon, saving time, maybe, reducing the personnel needed, in the surgery. Those types of things are what they think about to make it more efficient. On the IT front, it's a little different because IT can be, very inexpensive, right? And so it's software and so forth. And so, but again, what is it doing to the overall system? Is it, kind of helping to make things more efficient for the facilities? So that's just kind of the back end thinking on
I'll
it.
say one more thing about the surgical tools, because this comes up, somewhat often. If you want to make an impact and help patients, someone needs to sell that device and distribute it and everything else. And that person generally is interested in the economic side of it. And so there needs to be a way for them to make money. A lot of the problem with surgical tools is that, and I'm thinking maybe more simple tools, particularly in the orthopedic space, is that you give someone a osteotome and they can use it 5,000 times, and you sell it one time and it costs $100. So you have to think about the economic model, because it would be really hard to find somebody who wants to commercialize a new osteotome design, if that makes some sense. So there's a lot of different models that people go after. Razor blade model is the most common, but you have to, just because it's a good idea and it would help patients, doesn't mean that it would be, a commercializable opportunity.
Especially, so it does seem that healthcare in the United States is moving toward more and more. So, orthopedic surgery is a great example where bundled payments has become a thing. But I think that bundled payments, and I think this because other people have told me this, right? Like, this seems like the way things are going is more capitated care. Do medical devices and med tech in particular, which are quite costly devices, how does that change our outlook going forward over the next 20 years about the kinds of research we need to do? Do we need to start looking at value earlier on in academic research, or some of these devices are really, really expensive. Yeah. So if you're talking about a capitated model, that's going to become. It seems to me like it could be really unattractive, and make some of these hurdles a lot bigger. How do you see this kind of thing going over the next 15 or 20 years?
Yeah, I mean it's
5 years.
Yeah, it's the whole. It's certainly one piece of it. I think Steve's point is really good. Can the company, can the individuals, make money off of the device? I mean, you've got to look at the whole economic picture to really understand how it fits in. But certainly on the bundled payment issue or any of the changes in healthcare system that is looking at where are the opportunities for not only lower cost devices, but for taking costs out of the system. And I know I've said this several times now, but it's so, it's so key. So again, a post-surgical pain, management system that we have to offer could potentially, again, reduce length of stay. It could reduce, other alternatives that they're using. It could discharge patients to home instead of to skilled nursing. I mean, those are all the economic, things that are occurring. So there's a lot of health economic experts that really focus on these health economic studies and, kind of looking at, really how you can do some of that. I'm sure there's maybe some here at Case that, from the business school or whatever, that I think, thinking about that, it's never too early to start thinking about that. And just, even you may not know the exact numbers, but just in the modeling of it, what is this going to do? Are you taking cost out? Are you adding costs? Is it neutral? How is it going to all play out?
I think that if you asked someone 5 years ago what their value proposition was, it would be all about the clinical impact it would have. And now a big portion of that value proposition is the economic impact of it as well. I think one of the other things that makes this really difficult right now, the space that we're in, is that we're in this period of change from the current model to the theoretical capitated model. And that's happened in a couple of different areas, but it's very uncertain, which areas will be affected and kind of the time frame that they'll convert over. And it does make it difficult if you're trying to innovate a device that reduces the cost of something, but also reduces like the amount of procedures that a physician would do, which currently they make a lot of money from doing each of those. So it is, the timing issue is becoming a bigger and bigger issue.
I don't know. I think healthcare policy in the U.S. is pretty well settled. So maybe.
So in the 20
your
years
quota's
of
up.
developing this, I mean, the one thing that we always say is that It's never a straight path in this industry, whatever the device or the tool is. There's always a curvy road that you're going to have to take. And so understanding the contingencies. So what happens if we go to bundled payment? Then how are we going to price our device? What happens if, this clinical outcome is not going to play out as expected? Well, do we have a secondary outcome that's going to be just as meaningful? I mean, it's just, really planning on those contingencies. Warren likes to call us the chameleon because we've just changed over and over again, but that's also how I think we've been able to survive, because we just plan for those
I don't think
things
that's
that
just
could
your
occur.
company.
It's everybody.
That's how you
yeah,
become
yeah.
successful
Yeah,
at adapting to some of these.
Right.
I do think, though, and this is a little maybe dangerous to say, being in Case and running the Coulter program, is that a lot of the innovation and the high worth innovation is not going to be on the device side and things that you sell. I think a lot of it's going to be in the process and how you deliver care and make it more efficient and make it higher end. A lot of it's going to be IT.
You look at Cover My Meds and their recent success.
Sure,
and
yeah.
some other
First
things
$1 billion
there.
acquisition in Ohio.
Yeah.
I think Cameron has a question.
So, I guess, back to the...
Was
No, you don't get the microphone.
you can hold it for me, okay? So that and a lot of times these software things, as a standalone, they have zero value or maybe even negative value. But what they do is augment value of a bigger product, right? And so it's a completely different kind of business model, and one that is almost intentionally designed from the get-go to be a build to exit, because
Right,
as a standalone, it has no value.
Yep.
But that's something that academics, I think, actually are capable of doing. We can't build a brand new stimulator from scratch unless you're Hunter or some very unique situation. But yeah. So, but so that's a completely different kind of context. But I think Steve's right. The opportunity for growth in that area is really substantial
Huge.
for both diagnostics
There were-
and for device augmentation, I guess.
Yeah, I just read the other day that the amount of information that an internal medicine physician has to consume to stay current with the literature is reading 26 hours per day, right? And that is expected to double every year for like the next 20 years. So it is impossible to stay current with the literature. And so the current way that internal medicine practices medicine isn't sustainable, right? And so there are going to be changes. You look at IBM is investing a ton of money in this to try and do these, assistive decision-making systems. And you look at that for internal medicine, but you could apply it to really any specialty and allowing practitioners to better care for their patients. It's not taking away the decisions, it's just giving them more information.
And if you go to like the Cleveland Clinic's Innovation Summit, when they're talking about innovation, this is a lot of what they're talking about. It took me years to understand. When we talk about innovation, we're talking about like improvements to devices and stuff. When they talk about innovation, they're talking about making physicians more efficient at delivering care.
And devices are part of that, for sure.
But it's bigger, right? Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how many of you tuned in to the workshop that NCMRR hosted last week. It was called Optimizing the NIH Investment in Medical Rehabilitation, Medical Devices in Rehabilitation. Does anybody log into that?
I was there.
You did, okay. So Andy knows that the focus of this was really, this is really to my community here. These guys know this. But the context of this was really reducing risk, okay? And I think that it's very, very clear if you were at the meeting, listening to the meeting, or especially in the sidebar conversations, that NIH as a whole, all of the institutes that are supporting the work of us here, okay? NICHD, NINDS, NIBIB principally, right? But others, DOD, NSF, are all concerned about the fact that translation isn't working. When they look at what they see as success stories that they have for this multiple millions of dollars of investment, they don't see much coming out the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And they're very concerned about that, okay? And they want to have programs, they want to figure out how can they find the gaps that will enable this kind of translation to take place. Now, this is a good thing, in many ways because, presumably the objective of NIH is to reduce the burden of disease. That happens to be, in the mission statement, reduce the burden of disease. But I think we also know that reducing the burden of disease only happens if you can translate the science, et cetera, into products. And so they're looking at how can they get more effective translation taking place. I think this is an opportunity for this community, especially the leaders in this community, to speak out about where these gaps are and help them to find this. And I think that on the other end, if we are not, I would say, here I want to change the statement. We are trying to figure out how we do things that are translatable and impact patient care here. But we can also say, if we look inside of our box, we aren't being as effective as we could be. Okay, and so I think that that this change that's going on, in the healthcare economics and the in NIH and how we structure ourselves is really an opportunity for us to really dig in that box. And I think the things that we're hearing here are about commercialization are all part and parcel of finding the solutions. And I think unless we in this in our community, dealing principally with federal support, are cognizant of this and getting on that bus, then you're going to be left at the bus stop. End of pontification.
I think that's a great way to end, actually. Sort of increasing our overall awareness of some of these issues will increase our effectiveness as researchers. That's the hope, anyway. You guys have any kind of closing comments?
So I totally agree with that. We're trying, I think the earlier you understand about some of the parameters that are going to be necessary for translation, which could be way down the road, the better it helps you align the research that you're working on right now. And we're trying to develop programs at the university to try and help people to kind of raise the tide, right? Because I think that will make a big impact.
So no, I just thank you for your comments and discussion today. This was a real pleasure for me to kind of come back and tell the story, and just happy to kind of follow up if there's any questions. Andy's got my contact information, but I think that this community, it's not an easy road to develop a technology, to bring a new idea, but if you have a lot of passion behind it, you really believe that it's going to impact patients' lives, you can make it happen. That sounds really cliche too, but so reach out, build that network, reach out to people that have done it. I've got a great support system around me, and I rely on and lean on them heavily. So please just continue to do that. I think Steve's got great resources, and the university here, and then just our network within this community. So
Great. Well, thank you guys very much. We've got for each of you these nice
very much.
Cleveland photo books for.
Thank you very
thanks
much.
for joining our panel. Please join me in thanking our guests.